Hi, we move into Genesis 16 today. A different story than what we've seen before, a story that involves two women for the first time, Sarai and Hagar. And Abram has to figure out what his role is in between these two women and what the role of Yahweh is in the question of who's going to get pregnant and who's going to have a child to fulfill the covenant that in the previous chapter Yahweh had promised to Abram, completing and repeating the promise of chapter 12 that nations would come forth from him. Before we get to this exciting story, and it is an incredibly exciting story, I'm going to make this video to just go over some of the ways this story has been interpreted over the centuries and how different it is now. One of the good news about doing this project, this whole Radical Bible project now, is the enormous amount of great work that's been done in recent years by women and people of color and others, not only on this chapter, but on the whole Bible, overcoming some previous prejudices and faulty methodologies, and really bringing forth insights about the text that have never been heard before because of previous methods. So I'm just going to go over that briefly today, and I've highlighted, as you can see on the left side of the screen, the names, because curiously, neither of those are actually names. Sarai means perhaps princess, and Hagar means the foreigner or the immigrant. And so the two women we have named are being named with descriptions and roles rather than actual names. Of course, that's not that different than Abram, whose name means something, nor Isaac's or others as well. But we'll be getting that. We'll also be getting to many other things about the chapter, the way it's structured, the way that Hagar here is parallel with Abram at one level and Moses at another. But before we can get to those exciting issues, we have to at least establish how we're coming at it. So perhaps for Christian readers, the most commonly known understanding of the story is taken from Paul in Galatians, already within what we have as the Bible. And I just printed it there on the right side of the screen so you can hear exactly what he's saying. Now, this is an allegory, explicitly stated. These women are two covenants. One woman, in fact, is Hagar from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. Now, Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. Now, Paul, of course, I just want to say, of course, is just making that up. There's nothing whatsoever in the text to support one word that he's saying there, but he's using that as part of his larger argument. And we've looked at a little bit of his larger argument. We looked at Genesis 15:6, the question of God attributing righteousness to Abram for his faith. So Paul plainly was spending time in these chapters, but much like his compatriot Philo, writing in Alexandria, he was not bound by any of the kinds of principles of interpretation that modern scholars would be bound by. So he feels free to just turn the story into something useful to him, as Philo does, using allegory on a different angle. In his work, he repeats this interpretation a number of times. He sees Hagar as a stand-in for what he calls, quote, preliminary studies. In other words, people are just getting started on the journey toward philosophical wisdom that he's all about in his Platonic way of seeing things. And Sarah, in contrast, is seen as, quote, virtue or, quote, wisdom. And so very different than Paul's allegory, but there's nothing controlling either allegory other than what's in the mind of the writers. So that's how it starts. And within the centuries, we continue to see that, but the content of the allegory shifts. And it comes about in people like Jerome with an incredibly ironic view that Hagar represents the Jews and Sarah the church, whereas, of course, for Jewish authors, Sarah is the mother of Israel, and Hagar is something else, mother of Ishmael, but the question of Ishmael is a debated one. So the idea that a Christian writer in the 4th century could turn this story so inside out and make Hagar an expression of the people opposed to the very people who are the descendants of the authors of the story just shows how far those things can go. And if you want to know more about the horrors of Jerome, you can read my chapter in Empire Baptized. And Jerome clearly was a horrible human being, and I'm just going to say this on the record here, perhaps the most horrible human being with a capital S Saint in front of his name. So that's how it started for first centuries. Simultaneously, a series of developments making Hagar or Ishmael representative of various groups, ethnic groups, is a category I have in quotes because that perhaps is not the technically right word for the range of categories, but I wanted to highlight these that over the centuries see this as speaking to groups in the audience's context. So first, in the non-canonical book of Jubilees, which is in many ways a retelling of the book of Genesis in light of later concerns, and the writing of the historian Josephus, both in around the 1st century of the Common modern era, Ishmael becomes the father of quote-unquote Arabs. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, but it certainly can become much later when those interpretations are cited in light of Jewish-Arab conflicts in the modern day. Jerome again saw Ishmael as the ancestor of the Saracens, and this is before the Saracens equaled Muslims, which is what you see from Venerable Bede in the 8th century. So Saracens was a term used there out of a different etymology before Muhammad came along, and it was associated with the Muslims, not by the Muslims themselves, of course. So that was one step, and then Bede makes Ishmael the ancestor of all Muslims. Curiously, in the Quran, Ishmael is a saint and a holy person, but it's not because these people are reading the Quran. It's because they were trying to other Hagar and Ishmael over against their sense of Christian superiority. Later in the Renaissance and Reformation, that expands it out to mean, or more specifically, I guess, the Turks, because of the power of the Ottoman Empire after the Crusades and such. So the Turks in Europe and Asia there were part of the hostility that we saw among the Christian empires in that time period. And then all of that follows in the 20th century, where it continued to represent the Palestinians. And so then we see with Abram's kicking out of Hagar and Ishmael, therefore the Israelis can kick out Palestinians on those interpretations. Fortunately, although those interpretations are still around, no modern biblical scholar would affirm those, although one can still hear them in churches, because churches are obviously not bound by biblical scholarship. Let's look at a couple other categories here as we continue to look at this. So there's a series of moral judgment interpretations. Notice in these ethnic ones, there doesn't have to be a moral judgment. You can say that the Ishmaelites represent the Muslims without having a positive or negative view of the Muslims, and the same with all these categories. But this group of interpretations clearly decides that one of the characters is bad, Hagar is bad, and then applies that to modern people who are supposed to be the descendants or people like that. So medieval Jewish common interpreters, which may be a strange category to a modern Christian person listening to a video or watching a video like this, but they were very important for several centuries. There were a number of famous Jewish interpreters. Rashi is probably the best known, and they were very thoughtful and ran very deep, and they struggled over the question of the women's character. They didn't do what you might expect, was defend Sarai and attack Hagar. They were fair interpreters given their methodologies, and really struggled over the questions of the women's characters here. But Luther, on the other hand, charges Hagar with quote-unquote ingratitude and insolence, but then doesn't condemn her altogether. So that was Luther's view, which then gets played out and also in the context of his argument with Catholicism over the interpretation of Paul in Genesis 15, and we won't get into all that. Following that tradition in the modern era, in the 20th century especially, we see a number of interpretations to see Ishmael as somehow a problem child needing to be fixed. Either he's done bad things to Isaac, and that's part of the interpretation of chapter 21, or something else is considered not right about him, maybe because his mother is seen as not right and he's inheriting it, but usually things not based on the actual text, but based on some assumptions, and that somehow something needs to be fixed there. And of course that could apply to the idea of the Palestinians are problem children and they need to be fixed as well. But then in the modern era, starting with the 80s, we get an explosion of feminist interpretations, not just of this chapter, of course, and not just of the Bible, but of feminist interpretations that, starting from the work in the 60s, began to explore the legacy of patriarchy across numerous cultural contexts. And the central person who got this going for the Bible is Phyllis Tribble and her famous book, Texts of Terror. And I'm going to show you pictures of all these people here, because these are human beings. And I think in a story that is about a person who has no real name, and Sarai won't talk to her, it's important that the interpreters do have faces and are real people. So Phyllis Tribble, really, if we want to apply the adjective queen here, I think that's fitting, the queen of feminist and biblical interpreters. I included Margaret Atwood here because she's not a biblical interpreter, but perhaps her interpretation is the best known, The Handmaid's Tale, which is based partly on Genesis 16 and partly on Genesis 30, the question of Rachel and Leah's handmaids, and the giving birth on the knees, as is described there. But she takes the basis of the story and turns it into a fundamentalist Christian theocracy that turns women into these handmaids. And of course, it's a famous film and TV show as well. So, moving back to biblical scholarship, we see Elsa Temez, just 2 years after Phyllis Tribble, the Mexican scripture scholar, a liberation scripture scholar, seeing Hagar, quote, the voice of the marginalized in history. Um, and as we'll talk in a moment, a number of these feminist interpreters at this time were still within the kind of interpretive paradigms methodologically that all biblical scholars were at the time. And I'll show some of that down here. But worth noting here is that both Elsa Temez and Dolores Williams, the great womanist, which would say African American interpreter, uh, follow the assumptions of biblical scholarship at the time that there were multiple sources and that Genesis 16 is one source and Genesis 21 is another source, as opposed to reading them as part of a continuous narrative, and also seek to apply ancient legal codes to the situation, which we'll talk about it again in a minute. So who knows what they would say today, but fortunately there are other women following in their footsteps who are using different methodologies more recently. So it starts with Elsa Temez, Hagar's the voice of the marginalized, and Savina Tubal doing some very creative research, and I'll use some of that in my work as we go through the chapter, seeing Hagar as part of a tradition of desert matriarchs, and she's trying to get behind the story, not so much to sources in the sense of the priestly or the Yahweh sources, but to original female-oriented sources that she thinks were then covered over by patriarchy. She can't prove that, and so a lot of scholars have not taken that too seriously, but it's worth thinking about because there are so many aspects of the story that are hidden behind editorial actions that we can't uncover these days. And then Dolores Williams, Dolores Williams sadly died in 2022, so we lost her at the age of 85, but a pioneer of womanist theology, which is to say African American women looking at what we would now call the intersectional oppression of being a woman of color and a woman, a person of color and a woman. And so she presents Hagar as the voice of black slave and other mothers and also surrogates. And her over 60-page chapter excerpt from a larger book here is about 15 pages or a biblical exegesis, and the rest of it are stories of black women across history and stories by black women about women, including some of the classics by Alice Walker and others. So Dolores Williams' work really foundational and cited by almost all the other women and others that have written since then in the last decade. Ginny Brewster Boyden, using the focus in the chapter of the Hebrew Givarah and seeing Sarah as a queen mother. So taking a feminist perspective to not just see Hagar as a victim, but to see Sarah's role in a different way than scholars traditionally have. And similarly, Susan Piggott, writing the same year independently of each other, Sarah as a mother patriarch, which to say her role there is similar to Abram here. But notice that'll be parallel to what we see as Hagar as a desert matriarch back here, and we'll also see Hagar as parallel to Abram. So we can see both characters that way. Several recent thematic interpretations, and we're going to look at all of these here. Rebecca Copeland doing what she calls an ecomimetic interpretation, which she says she's going to look at water as a character, and she's following not from a feminist train of thought, from the Earth Bible train of thought that began to look more closely at how important creation is to the Bible, but how Western Christianity, especially because of Platonism, separated human nature from the rest of nature to the loss not only of our relationship with non-human creation, but loss of understanding of the Bible and other texts. So she goes back and doesn't just note water in the story, but water as a character in the story of responding to things, and the wells and flowing water are both part of that, and it's fascinating. We'll see elements of that. Patrick Crayer, who's working on translation issues in particular, and so that's his field, and he will focus on the translation of Ishmael more positively, which the New RSV, which I have up here and I've been using throughout all this Radical Bible program, has a triple negative interpretation of Ishmael, and he will show how it can all be read positively as well. And then finally, under thematic interpretations, is Philippa Lucas, writing from the UK, about whether there are parallels in the story to sex abuse in the church. And obviously, it's not a direct parallel because Abram and Sarai are not quote unquote religious leaders, and there's no institutions, etc. But that doesn't stop her from looking at some of the questions of parallels there. So a whole range of positive readings, and we're going to use all of these and others from commentaries as we enter into the story itself. And as we do that, I just want to highlight the series of older interpretive assumptions that are now mostly abandoned. You'll still see some recent interpretations that follow up on the old methods, but largely abandoned. The first one is that there's some kind of core historical event behind the text. And we see the evidence of scholars doing that when they want to talk about things like the oral tradition or the original story or behind the narrative and things like that. But as I've been saying throughout, and modern scholars I think are pretty unanimous about this, there's no basis for deciding there's any kind of historical evidence behind the story, and it's almost certain that the Genesis as a whole is written so much later than the time period in the story that the idea that there could be memory other than the broad sense of cultural memories, that cultures tell stories of the past without having any basis for knowing whether those stories relate to events that actually happened or not, because there's no way to know. There's no photographs and there's no archaeological evidence or any other kind of proof. And so it's almost certain that all of Genesis, including this story, or writings from the exile to give the people in exile wisdom that will restore them after the exile, but not a historical event behind it. And so out of that basis, also, there's no basis for suggesting, as many scholars spend an enormous amount of time doing, asking whether the behavior of the characters in Genesis 16 or 21 are, quote, legal or not, according to codes of law that are presumed to be relevant. The most famous one is the Hammurabi Code, and of course that was in Mesopotamia and could have some relevance to exiles because of Babylon. But Hammurabi's code is 1,000 years before the exile. It's from the second millennium BCE, which is ostensibly the time period of the story of Genesis, not the time period in which it was likely written. But that's so far beyond the audience's memory that there's no way to know if they would know those codes or otherwise. The Nutsi archives represent the codes of the Hittite Empire, which is closer, but still there's no reason to think that the audience, the authors would know those codes, but even less to think that characters in the story would be paying attention to legal codes at all. Just think of a simple analogy from American history that when white people began to move west across the Appalachians, it was immediately called the Wild West because there was no law. There may be a sheriff with a badge and a gun, but as we've seen from countless Western movies, etc., law enforcement only had the respect of the gun if he had more guns than the other people. So once you move outside of cities, even in the modern world, law is a very questionable controller of human behavior. But in the ancient world, even less so. We can easily forget that what we think of as the police or a 19th century invention. In the Roman Empire, there was hardly any law enforcement, and almost certainly only for the elite around issues that the elite were concerned with. There were very few bureaucrats and not courts the way we understand them in every local town, and police officers, and if not every corner, at least driving around looking for things. And so as soon as you got outside of cities in the ancient world, it's really hard to say that law, in the sense of words that could be enforced with threats of punishment, actually had any influence whatsoever. For Israelites with Torah, perhaps that's different. And although Torah has been translated law, really it's instruction and has much more to do with the way of life that people incorporate into them, much like in a family. Parents teach their children, that's not how we do it here, but there's not necessarily a legal system of enforcement over those behaviors. It's more of a moral framework that people agree to amongst themselves. So there's no reason to think that ancient formal royal legal codes have any relevance to the choices made, even if the characters can be presumed to know about those codes, which we can't assume. And I went on a long time about that because I think it's really important to recognize there is no framework for them to determine what to do here. So another element that I've already hinted at, that Genesis 16 and 20 are from different sources, traditionally the priestly source or an Elohist source. But as we've been seeing throughout, modern scholarship has largely abandoned that. Sometimes we still see P and so-called non-P, which referred to both J, the Yahweh source, and E, the Elohist source, earlier referred to. But more and more scholars are reading this simply as a continuous narrative, and that's what we're going to do here. And then finally, an assumption that is no longer applicable most of the time, that the quote goodness of Sarai as a biblical matriarch and of Yahweh as God can't be challenged. In other words, we have to interpret their behavior under the assumption that they're good. So when Yahweh tells Hagar to return and submit to the unjust behavior of her mistress Sarai, earlier scholars had to assume that Yahweh was good, and so therefore that had to be a good assumption. But nobody on the side of a victim like Hagar could see it that way. So more modern scholarship can challenge whether Yahweh is good in the way whoever is interpreting goodness thinks it's good, and similarly with Sarai as a character, that the biblical characters are not saints and they can be challenged, and the biblical authors expected them to be challenged, just like in many ways Yahweh is challenged. Abram will, when he's Abraham, will challenge Yahweh in just 2 chapters about what goodness looks like. So the ancient writers and characters could argue with Yahweh, as the rabbis do in the Midrash as well, and so that view has been restored now. So I'll refer back to this as we go, but I hope this will help as we enter into the story in the next video to see how what we're doing is so discontinuous with all this early material, but is growing out of the kind of work that we're blessed to have from modern scholarship. So we'll dive into Genesis 16 in the next video. See you then. Bye-bye.